When there are huge problems in the way a country is being run, ladies and gentlemen, we need to step in. We need to step in to help make a change for the next generation of citizens, to help our children. Because for them, austerity is hope for a better world. So what do we stand for today? We stand for austerity measures implemented gradually in Europe, because we see that currently that the best way to recover from the economic crisis and have a basis for sustainable long-term economic development. We also want a more collaborative approach between the IMF and countries with regards to the implementation of these measures. We support measures like partial debt forgiveness, whereby only the principal sum is paid back to the creditor and the interest can be forgone in exchange for structural reforms within the borrowing nation. Proposition today has to prove to us how, under an abandonment of austerity measures, Europe is going to be able to recover from the economic and political crisis that's going on there, especially in the light of the sovereign debt crisis right now. But before we move on to my constructive matter for this evening, let's talk about a few points of rebuttal. Let's talk about the social consequences that they brought up today. They've talked to us a lot about unemployment, how they're going to cut off services, and the loss of welfare. But ladies and gentlemen, we have to analyze one thing. First of all, it's mitigating. Because governments aren't going to start targeting your police force and your education. They're more likely to keep these things intact because they want the societies to remain. But let's engage them on their grounds and destroy the response. Let's look at the long term, ladies and gentlemen. Why is it worse on their side when they don't have austerity measures? When they don't have austerity measures, people aren't going to be willing to invest in the country because they see the irresponsible government spending that's happening there. As a result, the country is not going to receive any loans. So it's a worse situation because your government isn't going to be able to pump back any more money to solve the problems of unemployment. At least on our side, with the austerity measures, we can solve the problems of unemployment in the long term. Because when our economy recovers, when the debts are paid off and creditors are able to give us more money, then these problems can be solved under our side. Let's talk about structural reforms. Under their side, when they abandon austerity measures, it means they're abandoning all the structural reforms that come along with it. As a result, we are bound to see things like we are bound to see even more consequences on their side. Because when the government doesn't reform, when the government doesn't change its spending habits, and the government can still leave itself susceptible to an economic crisis, this just means that there are more harms on their side than on ours. When we have structural reforms on our side, as I'm going to prove to you in my substantive later on, these harms are even more mitigated. So they've talked to us about how people are going to leave the country. Once again, let's analyze the short term and the long term. First of all, in the long term, with austerity measures, these people are always going to return back to this country, and there's not going to be a brain drain. And in fact, under their side, when they don't implement austerity measures, the people are going to start losing faith in their government because they're going to start seeing that they haven't changed their ways, and as a result, the brain drain is going to be even worse on their side. Let's talk about the economic point that they've raised us today. Once again, moving on to structural reforms. When they've talked to us about how productivity is going to be less, and how it's going to hence harm economic growth, we see that it's much worse on their side. Because on their side, irresponsible government spending, on their side, nothing's changing within the government itself. Meaning that the very problems that caused the economic crisis within Europe still remain. As a result, we're bound to see more crises occurring again and again under their side, ladies and gentlemen. They haven't solved the problem. Furthermore, they haven't given us a solution to austerity. What they've told us is that austerity is bad, but they haven't exactly proven to us which method they're going to employ otherwise. This is not a good. This just means that austerity is the only hope for these nations, and if they tell us that they have to abandon austerity, they're going to have to provide us an alternative for the austerity measures. We challenge the next speaker to bring it up to us. So now on to my constructive method. I'm going to be talking to you about how our side promotes economic growth and how we increase private investors' confidence. My second speaker is going to talk to you about how we encourage long-term governmental reform and how we change the citizens' behavior. Together, we're going to prove to you that austerity can only lead to prosperity. So let's move on to my first substantive. Now, we have to accept the simple premise that the Eurozone crisis, no thank you madam, the Eurozone crisis is mostly due to irresponsible government spending. And this happens because governments want the people's votes and the people's support. So they tend to yield every single demand of the populace without the necessary cost-benefit calculus. So these governments just keep spending excessively and wastefully on wasteful public programs with borrowed money. The situation in this case is extremely unsustainable, as budget deficits just continually keep increasing until governments go near the risk of default. So the same thing is going to happen when austerity measures are taken away, because we're not solving the root cause of the problem. We can give you the example of Spain, in which the various regions in Spain spend billions of dollars to compete to build infrastructure for prestige. One of the projects involved was an opera house which took 15 years to construct and $1.1 billion to build. Ladies and gentlemen, imagine what we could have done with that money in that case. So, let's look at the comparative. Austerity means that governments have to use even more prudent spending. They're going to have to carefully consider how they're spending their things. So governments learn to make a more efficient cost-benefit calculus, because austerity is an uncomfortable economic situation in the short term. So to avoid repeating the exact same situation where spending has become so unsustainable, austerity is the only way out, they're bound to change their ways and stop spending wastefully in the future. So our side deals with the root cause of the problem, the excess spending leading to unsustainable debt in the future. We can give you the example of Iceland, which adopted austerity measures in 2008. Since then, we've seen the government spending has been closely monitored and annual GDP growth has grown by 5%, unemployment decreased by 3%, ladies and gentlemen, showing you how beneficial austerity can be in those circumstances. Let's talk about my second point on how we boost investor confidence within the countries. Without austerity measures, the government continues to spend and budget deficits simply keep increasing. So the government runs into a risk of default in these cases, where they cannot pay back their loans. So the credit ratings of the country go down as a result, because the country is seen as unreliable and irresponsible. So this decreases the level of confidence that investors have within this country. As a result, private investors are going to see that their investments in the countries can't make any profits, and foreign governments can't get return on their taxpayers' money when they do invest in these countries. As a result, these private investors are not going to loan their money to these countries which don't have austerity measures as a result. But once austerity measures are removed under their side, the creditors see that the countries have unsustainable debt and do not improve on it. As a result, they're even more reluctant to give loans to the government, and they may even refuse to give loans to Europe altogether because of the situation there. So the government's ability to receive loans and spend on truly necessary projects within their countries in the long run, like economic development, is dragging down growth on their side, ladies and gentlemen. Let's do a comparative. On our side, with austerity measures, governments show that they are committed to repaying the loans and repaying the debts, and they're taking serious measures to ensure this. As a result of this, as a direct result, investors are more willing to invest in these economies so that they have more money to inject back into the public and grow their economies. We give the example of how in June 2014, the Syriza-led government in Greece went against austerity measures, claiming that it was freezing a planned sale of some of its biggest shares in Greece's biggest refinery, Hellenic Petroleum. Private investors seeing this lost faith in Greece and for true reform and sustainable budget, and Greece's credit ratings dropped tremendously, seen in how the bonds of Greek interest rates rose above 11%. So for all these reasons, because austerity can only lead to prosperity, I am very proud to oppose.